First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to present to you here today, and as you can see from our title slide, what we're trying to do is emphasise the translation of the science, or the journey from a lot of the work research you've heard, particularly from the morning session, and how that is actually practically applied in elite cycling. So as the title outlines, from the lab to the musette. So we're going to kind of do a bit of a double act here, and I'll let Louise explain that, but I'd first of all like to thank Louise for attending and contributing to the session, and formally introduce her. Louise is the head of nutrition at the AIS and is going to share some of her wealth of knowledge and experience with you. So over to you, Louise.
Thanks, David. Now, we've seen a few nice models that have been provided to us by the boffins in cycling, and my equation for the nutrition model for success in sport is much simpler than theirs. You don't have to log transform anything, and what I'm going to try and show you is how each of these parts work. So what we're going to try and do is sort of work through the process of each of these different parts in my nutrition equation. First of all, looking at the background science behind some of these ideas, particularly the kinds of research that gets done in laboratory situations, and often probing the mechanistic type of underpinning. That's all really important, but I think the next phase is, which is the area or the domain in which I work, which is trying to take some of that really lab-based, very physiological approach to sports nutrition, and then try and adapt it into more applied scenarios, looking at research that tries to simulate the real event conditions, and it really tries to work on this kind of periodised, very complicated, rather than the very simplistic starting point that a lot of research comes from. And this is the time when you're not only just working with elite athletes or athlete groups, but you're also perhaps into the product development phase, and so David will be able to talk about that from the industry perspective. And I think a really important part of the whole equation, though, is this next bit, this placebo effect. And I think that's a really important part of what we do. And it's not to be sneered at or thought of as just, oh, that's why supplements work, because people just believe in them. And I think the placebo effect is a really important part of what we should be trying to add to our work, and that is the confidence that you build into the interactions that you have with your athletes, and that those best relationships can add a level of support for the athlete where he really or she feels really engaged and feels that they've got something special that other people haven't got, and it does help them with their performance because they do have that extra little bit that they feel. And sometimes that involves a bit of mystique and secrecy when it comes to whether you want to publish your research or share it all in a group where some of your competitors' service providers are in the audience, but that's all part of the fun as well. And the success outcome is being able to show that you can implement all those ideas in the field, and that there's some good performance results as a consequence. But I think that whole idea of consolidating those relationships with the athlete and making sure this whole equation does work is part of what you should be looking for as the successful outcome. So what David and I are going to try and do for you is to take some of the themes in sports nutrition, and we've picked carbohydrate supplementation, ergogenic aids, protein, and go through each of those scenarios, the background research that led then into some more applied research or individualisation of these strategies, and then getting some feedback from riders and people who work in the trenches about how it works when they implement it. We would have loved to have had some there with us, but in their absence we've been able to, or particularly David's been able to grab some comments and some feedback from them to feed to you about how well that process works. So I'm going to now hand over to David, and he can start with the background science to our first theme, sports nutrition.
Thank you, Louise. So for those that attended the session prior to this, I'm going to try and do the same thing that James did and surmise 50 years of research in 5 minutes. But there's a recent review that's, I believe, published ahead of print by Steningworth and Cox that really nicely summarises the performance effect of carbohydrate supplementation. And you can see here the chart outlines it, but in red at the top, they collected 61 studies on carbohydrate and endurance performance, which included almost 700 subjects in total. And of all those studies, over 80% of them showed a performance effect. And that effect increases with the duration of the exercise intensity. So for those people that want reinforcement of the benefits of carbohydrate supplementation during prolonged endurance event, it's pretty clear. But to briefly give you the history and how we're going to move through the story of the historical background and the scientific research into application, it's been known for a long time that carbohydrate is an important fuel during exercise, and that the body's stores of carbohydrate are impacted by exercise, and maximising recovery of those stores can ultimately have a significant impact upon endurance capacity. And the early work that James alluded to earlier of Eddie Coyle's lab, showing that maintenance of blood glucose actually leads to an increased endurance capacity that is obviously linked to an elevated carbohydrate oxidation and a sparing of muscle glycogen, which in 2007 was consolidated in an ACSM position stand, where they recommended 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour for exercise lasting more than 1 hour. That's recently been updated by the IOC in the recognition of the need for higher amounts, and Smith and colleagues have conducted a number of studies in this field, particularly addressing the additional benefit of multiple transportable carbohydrates, which I'll come on to a bit later on. And in a nice multi-centre study, they showed a dose-response effect of carbohydrate intake during prolonged endurance exercise, and somewhere in the region of 80 grams per hour appeared to be the optimal amount of carbohydrate intake, although they did see benefits from 10 up to all the way up to 120 grams. More recently, there's been a lot of interest in the non-metabolic role that carbohydrate may play in endurance performance at a central level. So increased amount of research has shown that simply exposing the oral cavity to carbohydrates can have a neurological effect, which can impact upon motor performance and thus endurance exercise performance. And this is a recent publication actually linking the effect of mouth rinsing with a carbohydrate drink on brain motor function. In total, I think there are more than 7 studies, probably more since I've been speaking to you, that show that endurance performance is enhanced with this particular strategy of simply exposing the mouth to carbohydrate. But one important point to note is that those highlighted in yellow here, there seems to be an accentuation of the effect if you're in a fasted state. So it seems to be more potent if the athlete is either depleted or fasted pre-exercise. What also seems to be important is the amount of time that the carbohydrate is exposed to the oral cavity, so how long you swirl the carbohydrate in your mouth. And in this study they showed, Sinclair and colleagues showed that 10 seconds of mouth swilling gave the biggest benefit, which is an important consideration if you think how you're going to apply that and how achievable that would be in an exercising athlete. And one area that's of interest that perhaps may grow in this topic is that it's well known in the field of sensory nutrition that the chewing, mastication, the act of chewing can also have a similar impact upon brain function and motor performance. So maybe the drink form out of the mouth rinse isn't the best. Maybe you need to be thinking of a semi-solid or solid form. So I'll hand back to Louise to tell you how that advice and scientific evidence can be applied.
So I'm going to give 2 case histories where we've taken both an example of the metabolic role of carbohydrate to performance and the non-metabolic role, to see how we could take what was available in the scientific literature and start thinking of ways that we could make it more applicable to athletes in the trenches. And the first case history I'll give you is looking at the idea that it's good to have these very high rates of carbohydrate going in for the prolonged events, but you need to have your athlete being able to tolerate that from the gut point of view, and also ensure that that fuel is being delivered to the muscle where it's going to be used. And I'm hoping when I'm showing you these case histories that the data are not really just the important outcome, because you've probably read these studies and know what I'm going to tell you in terms of the results. But I'd like to sort of try and share with you the story of the process of doing the research and how we've tried to say, well, there's something that belongs in the laboratory, but I need it to be over here, and I need to find some way of bridging to that. And in some cases you do a study that answers all the questions that you might need to get from A to B. In some cases you're just adding a little bit to the story and you're still having to extrapolate a lot of the information. And so I think the whole process of doing the research is just as important as the outcome. So in the case of this story, we were really finding a requirement to try and adapt our athletes to be able to tolerate these large amounts of carbohydrate during exercise, and we wondered whether just simply practicing it in training would allow something about either the behaviour or the gut or some other physiological function to make the rider better able to tolerate and deliver the carbohydrate to the muscle where we want it. And we wondered whether some of that was about improving a gut reaction to intake, or whether some of it was about the muscle learning to take it up. We weren't sure. We're also thinking about the story of the train low, and the idea of, well, some of the sessions of training that you need to be doing to prepare yourself to compete need to be in that carbohydrate availability environment that you want for competition. So how could we try and sort of periodise into the training program some of these train high sessions? So the study I'm going to talk to you about is part of Greg Cox's PhD work, and we started very much from the beginning, and so I will apologise to you in advance by saying this is an example of the kind of research you do when you're at the beginning, where you have to compare black and white. So you do all of something or you do all of something else and compare things. And in this study we had 4 weeks of training under 2 different conditions in 2 different groups, where we had one group which did all their training with high carbohydrate availability that was achieved by having carbohydrate fed during the exercise session at these high rates. And we had another group that did the same sort of training. They had less carbohydrate overall in their diet, but they had certainly no carbohydrate going in around the training sessions, either during or just before. And we looked at performance changes and a whole lot of other metabolic adaptations, immune system, but one of the things we also looked at was the ability of the muscle to receive carbohydrate consumed during exercise and oxidise it. And here are the main results from that part of the study, and you can see that at the beginning of the 4 weeks of training we've measured the amount of carbohydrate that was consumed during exercise that was oxidised by the muscle using a C14 tracer. And the groups at the beginning were matched with their ability to oxidise the carbohydrate consumed during exercise. But after the 4 weeks of training, we found that the group that had consumed carbohydrate in all their training sessions had increased their ability to deliver it to the muscle and oxidise it by 14%. And so we've been able to show, we feel, that there's some evidence for the benefits of being able to do at least some of your training sessions with carbohydrate being consumed in the way that you want to be able to do it during the race scenario. So if I have a look at what that study actually achieved, well, we're able to show that you can enhance your muscles' ability to be able to utilise fuel that's consumed during exercise if you practice it in training. We measured what was happening at the muscle level and couldn't find any changes in GLUT4 or any of the other enzymes that might have helped explain it at the muscle level, and we felt that the adaptation may have been occurring in the gut in line with some of the other data, mostly from rats, which has shown that when you consume more carbohydrate you upregulate your ability to transport it across the intestine with certain transporter proteins. And we also found that there was a potential that we could not just improve performance through the delivery of the fuel, but also reduce the probability that there were going to be gut problems with high rates of carbohydrate intake during exercise, because it was actually being absorbed and delivered rather than left in the gut where it could cause some discomfort. So there were some benefits to doing that study, but we didn't answer a lot of the questions that you'd like to know in the field. We certainly didn't work out from our study how often you should be doing this kind of train high training, or how long the adaptations last, so that in terms of getting that bottom line question of how should you periodise this into the training program, we certainly couldn't answer it from this kind of study. And so we've then had to make a decision: do you go back and do more studies that tease out all those little bits of contributions, or can you take your best guess and apply it in the individual situation? And so far we've just gone with that individual situation response, but hopefully we may go back to it in the future and include it in future research. The other case study I'll talk to you about is the mouth sensing scenario, and we certainly saw the beginning of this literature appearing with the really robust results of this performance advantage just through putting carbohydrate into the mouth, but most of those early studies were done in the fasted state. And so we wanted to address the questions of will it still work if that rider has had carbohydrate for breakfast, if it's a short event that we're doing it, or if you're thinking about this having an additive effect in a long race where the carbohydrate consumed simply in the mouth can have an immediate effect on the brain and make the athlete feel better. And this is why you see now riders in those last kilometres of the Tour de France, even though there's not a lot of time for that carbohydrate consumed to get to the muscle to do something for the fuel side of things. Certainly we see now the riders grabbing that last gel in the last 10-15k, because we know that the mouth feel is going to make them just feel better and pace better. But we wondered if the fasted condition was important for getting the best bang for your buck out of this idea, and so rather than actually have carbohydrate, could you accentuate the outcome by depriving the athlete of carbohydrate in the hours before or some period of time during a race when you wanted this effect to be most felt. And we also thought that this idea of being able to just have carbohydrate in your mouth and not necessarily swallow it could have been benefit for athletes who have gut problems or who have a period during the race where they may feel uncomfortable, where at least you could say to them, well, pop it in your mouth and you at least feel better, and you can spit it out and you won't have to actually tolerate it for that period of time while you're feeling uncomfortable. And hopefully by being able to keep exercising hard, you'll be able to trade through that period and feel better, and then start the process of swallowing it later. So here's Steve Lane, and he, as part of his PhD work, did the study where we looked at both the fed and fasted conditions. We wanted to compare directly rather than looking at a whole lot of studies and trying to have each of them tell the story individually. So we had 4 trials where we had our cyclists either have a breakfast of about 2.5 grams of carbohydrate 2 hours before doing their 60-minute cycling time trial, and they either had the fast or fed condition, and then in the time trial either had a placebo mouth rinse or a carbohydrate mouth rinse applied every about 8 minutes during that particular burst. And we did do the 10-second mouth rinse idea. Here are the results from this study, and what you can see here is the mean power through the 60-minute cycling time trial. And if we have a look at the difference between the placebo rinse and the actual carbohydrate rinse, you can see the improvement in performance when a pre-race breakfast had been consumed was less in terms than when the athlete had been fasted. But the most important outcome is if you want to get the best bang for your buck, having both carbohydrate breakfast and the carbohydrate mouth rinse tells you the story. And if you don't have the carbohydrate intake pre-race, you're submitting yourself to a decrement in performance. So the bottom line from this study is that we were able to confirm that these mouth rinse benefits are real and worthwhile, that there's a better relative improvement in performance if you are in a carbohydrate deprived scenario, but the best effect, the best absolute effect, is when carbohydrate fueled. So if you have athletes that for one reason or another can't consume carbohydrate during exercise because of gut problems, then at least you can say that putting it in your mouth might be useful, but if you can actually swallow it, it will be beneficial. And we're talking about performance here, we're not talking about the training scenario that James mentioned before, where you may not want to have it going in for the metabolic effect. So we got some good answers from our study, but we still left some things unanswered around the protocols for consuming that or having the carbohydrate in your mouth. But we also found from not just our study, but from just generally talking in the peloton, that a lot of people have misinterpreted this literature, and a lot of cyclists actually think, or a lot of other athletes think, that you should have to spit this carbohydrate out, that part of the reason that it works is that you do spit it out. So we've had to go back and retell the story to athletes to say, unless there's a gut problem in this performance scenario, there's no reason why you wouldn't swallow the carbohydrate. It's not part of the whole mystique that you need to get rid of it, and that it's actually more practical to swallow it. That the reason that it hasn't been swallowed in these research trials was to completely divorce the idea that it could have been consumed and contribute to metabolic effects from the central effect. Now I'll pass over to David.
So hopefully that's been a nice step from the scientific evidence underpinning carbohydrate supplementation and exercise performance, and then some nice case studies where you can see how that is applied to an exercising model. To give you a little bit of insight into the product development side for a company like PowerBar is acknowledging that their users are endurance users and that they would benefit from the research on multiple transportable carbohydrates. Many of the products are made with that mixture of glucose or glucose polymers and fructose, and this is a recent meta-analysis that we were involved in, and it's showing that if we take all the studies that have looked at multiple transportable carbohydrates, utilising that mechanism of gut absorption through different methods, through different transporters, we see on average about a 5% improvement in endurance performance. So the evidence is being taken and applied to a product format. And that leads us to the recommendations, and this is adapted from ASCA's recent review on carbohydrate supplementation and exercise, and it quite nicely summarises what you would recommend to an athlete, a cyclist competing in an endurance event. If the event is less than 75 minutes, then small amounts of carbohydrate will suffice, and that could even just be a mouth rinse, as we've seen the performance benefit of that. If we're looking at 1 to 2 hours, 30 grams per hour of either single or multiple transportable. 2 to 3, a slightly higher dose, up to 60 grams per hour. But if you go beyond the 2.5 hours, evidence shows that there is a benefit of consuming the multiple transportable carbohydrate, if only to meet the intakes that have been shown to improve endurance performance. So as we mentioned at the beginning, we've had some feedback from one of the teams that are competing in the Tour de France, Orica Green Edge, and they've been actually able to give us the reality of the situation, and that's the purpose of this session here, is to show you that there's scientific evidence, there's specific applied research, but what's going on in the real world. And this is data taken from a stage of a recent stage race in Germany, and a couple of things I need to point out to you. First of all, it's not a mountainous stage, so the energy demands are quite different to the stereotypical Tour de France stage that involves excessive amounts of mountain climbing. And what's really interesting here is this is average power output during the race and accumulated energy expenditure. So you can quite clearly see here the rider who went on to win the race, his power output was below 200 watts for the first 5 hours of the race, and then almost 350 watts in the latter stages. So you can see that there's a clear pacing strategy that is beneficial for endurance performance and probably resulted in the win. The total amount of energy expended was in the region of 4,500 calories. If we assume that 2,000 of that is taken up within muscle and liver glycogen in a repeated athlete, and we applied those recommendations I outlined to you, if we were targeting that 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour, product in front of you there on the left, that's what it would look like. So 4 bars, 6 of the gels, 8 of the carbohydrate electrolyte drinks, and then the variety, some of the different formats. But what happened in reality? Well, the one on the right here. So 2 energy bars, one that has a bit of a protein and fat content, 3 gels, 4 drinks, and then the popular rice cake and paninis. So that's not, I don't believe that's a case that the scientific evidence is a mismatch here. I think this relates back to the demands of the event. If you look here, there's a relatively low intensity for the first 5 hours, so it's providing energy, perhaps not solely through carbohydrate for the first proportion of the race, but when it becomes important to deliver that carbohydrate in the latter stages of the race, that's when the carbohydrate supplements are used. And in this case, the rider reported that he used the 3 gels in the last hour because he was aware of the benefit, in addition to the fact that they contain caffeine, so there's an ergogenic property there too. Which leads quite nicely onto the second theme that we wanted to discuss, and that is the role of supplements in endurance performance. And as a starting point, I've taken the AIS sports supplement program as an outline as to how best to categorise and take the evidence surrounding these products, and they've quite nicely separated supplements into 4 distinct groups, groups A through D, and group A is the ones that are scientifically validated. There's clear evidence to show a beneficial effect in the context of the sporting event. Group B is the ones that I guess we get to hear about first. They're the ones that sound promising and there's growing evidence, but you perhaps wouldn't be entirely confident the existing evidence would enable you to put your mortgage on it if you're recommending them to an athlete. Group C is the ones that we try to, I guess, steer away from, where there's a lot of fad science behind it, and perhaps the scientific evidence and the mechanisms don't really stack up. And Group D is ultimately the ones that are either on a banned list or are of detriment to an athlete's health. So if I just summarise and draw your attention really to this side of the table, those in Group A, you can see we've already alluded to sports food, so the carbohydrate supplements, and we'll come on to talk a little about protein at the end. Medical supplements, obviously they have a specific need depending upon an athlete's and a cyclist's need in a race, But the ones that I'm going to overview now are the ones that fall under this performance supplement. So the ones that are pretty well known: caffeine, beta-alanine, bicarbonate, beetroot juice and creatine. So very briefly, I've tried to surmise the recommendations based upon the evidence behind each of these supplements. Caffeine, as you well know, is got a lot of established research behind it as an ergogenic supplement. The recommendation is 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo before exercise, and the mechanism is believed to be via stimulatory effects, and the benefits can be in the order of 1 to 4% in endurance performance. Creatine requires more of a chronic supplementation for a number of days before competition to increase muscle storage, and is particularly beneficial to high intensity repeated sprint type exercise that you would typically get in a flat stage of cycling. And the mechanism there is to increase the availability of phosphocreatine, and the benefit in the order of 1 to 3%. I'm sure everyone's aware of sodium bicarbonate. It comes with a few GI issues and challenges to address, but the recommendations again here is 300 milligrams per kilo in the hours before exercise, and its mechanism is through improving buffering capacity, so high intensity exercise where there's an accumulation of metabolic acidosis, the benefit again in the 1 to 2% area. Beta-alanine has a very similar mechanism to bicarbonate in that it looks to increase buffering capacity, but at an intracellular level by increasing the concentration or the content of muscle carnosine. That, similar to creatine, requires a more chronic supplementation period for up to 6 weeks, but as you're beginning to see the theme here, there's evidence to suggest that it gives a 1 to 3% improvement in endurance performance. And finally, and I guess pretty topical currently in the last few years at least, is the nitrate-rich beetroot juice that has been shown to improve endurance performance by an effect upon oxygen cost of exercise, and those performance gains have been again similar in the 1 to 3%. So hopefully that nicely captures that. So I can hand back to Louise to show how you would apply that.
So one of the research studies that we did back in the 1990s involved caffeine used in a different way to what the literature was saying at the time. Now, we already knew that some people had been using caffeine in different ways. Here's Frank Shorter, who in his book, when he talks about his gold medal win in 1972, outlines that he drank Coke, flat Coke, at each of the aid stations. We thought that was a bit of a curiosity. But I can remember in mid-1990s getting a phone call from Dave Martin in the middle of the night from a race in the US. He said, "You're not going to believe what's going on here. I'm at the feed zone, and suddenly at about 2/3 of the race, all the Gatorade and the Powerade and the sports drinks are being thrown out, and they're handing out Coke. You won't believe it. Why would you do that? There's millions of dollars of money being spent on sports drink research, and we know that Coke's got great marketing potential, but why would you throw out the science and go with this sticky black stuff?" And Dave, being Dave, he sat down and he typed out a survey form, and he managed to pull off a little pilot study at that feed zone and interview all the soigneurs from all the teams to find out just how entrenched this idea of using caffeine in Coke towards the end of the race was. And we looked at it and said, this is crazy. Why would you take such a small amount of caffeine in Coke at the end of a race when everyone knows that the science behind caffeine is to take these larger doses an hour prior to the event, so you've got large amounts of caffeine in the bloodstream and high circulating free fatty acids. Athletes are just so crazy. We just have to show them a lesson and do the study to show this is just stupid. So we did our study with it. We had a cycling protocol which had a 2-hour steady state protocol followed by a time trial where we could measure performance. We tried to set up the scenarios where athletes would be practicing good nutrition guidelines with having their pre-event meal. They drank sports drinks throughout the 2 hours of that time trial, but actually at about 100 minutes into the steady state portion, we changed one of the interventions in this trial, because we basically wanted to look at the effect of just having the sports drink all the way through with having the standard dose of caffeine taken 1 hour prior to exercise versus having that same amount of caffeine spread throughout the 120 minutes of the steady state. And in that last trial, or the fourth trial, we had the sports drink being switched over to the Coke. So compared to our placebo trial time of about 30 minutes, we found that the large doses of caffeine, whether they were taken before the event in the standard way according to science at the time or spread throughout the race, had a 3% improvement in performance, and the Coca-Cola had a 3% improvement in performance. So we looked at that and we said, oh, but of course, you know, that wasn't double-blinded. They knew they were getting the Coke in that last part of the race. So we went and did the study again. And this time we had everybody having sports drink for that first 100 minutes, and then at the 100-minute time point, everybody switched to a cola-flavoured beverage. In one case, it was just an 11% carbohydrate solution, recognising that the Coke carbohydrate content was higher than the sports drink. In another one, we had the addition of the small amount of caffeine to the 6% drink. And in the other condition we had the real thing, so we had extra carbohydrate and that 2 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine being applied towards the end of the race. And we found a 3% improvement in performance. Now I tell you, when you replicate your own results with the exact same outcome, you are so lucky, because that doesn't often happen in real life. But it really told a convincing story. This consistency of this about 3% improvement in performance with caffeine is really quite robust. And because of the design we did with the Latin squares, we were able to tease out that most of the benefit of the Coca-Cola came from the caffeine content, very, very small, but there was a little bit of an effect having the extra carbohydrate towards the end of the bout, which we now can explain why. So what we learned from this study was that sometimes athletes already know a lot more than we do, and our role is just merely to confirm what they already know, or perhaps explain why it works. And that we started to contribute to what is now quite a large literature that shows that caffeine is beneficial for sports performance in much smaller doses than had been previously used. And it's particularly beneficial in very small doses when it's given just before the onset of fatigue, that it doesn't have this metabolic role where you need to have a large time for the caffeine to be in the circulation and causing metabolic effects. And so I guess one of the things that we learned from this study was also that the way that athletes should use caffeine in sport has got much more similarity to the way that we use it in everyday life. I mean, none of you got up this morning and had 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram body weight and said, that's it for the day. You've all just topped up your caffeine over the time as you've got a little bit tired. So we now can probably draw more on our own experiences of caffeine use in our everyday life when we're informing what athletes should be doing. So there are a lot of things that we didn't answer with that study, but it certainly made us more aware of going back to some of the things we do know about caffeine from our own experiences or other research applications to inform the way you use it in real life. Now the other thing we need to think about with supplements is in many cases some of the kinds of ways in which supplements work or the kinds of events that they target aren't unique. That in some events you could have a number of different kinds of ergogenic aids which could address the physiological limitations to performance. And so the big question is, if you put them all together, do you get an additive effect? David showed us quite nicely that we can expect a 1% or a 2% improvement in performance, but if you stack them all up, would you end up with a 15% improvement in performance by having them all? Unlikely. But we wanted to get to the bottom of how important is it to have a strategic layering of the use of supplements when more than one of them could be of benefit to your kind of event. And so the case history that I'll give to you now is one that we did prior to the London Olympics, where we wanted to look at the combination of things that we might think would be beneficial for the cycling time trial, where we thought that the mouth rinse and caffeine and nitrate might all independently enhance the time trial outcome, but we wanted to see if it worked when they all went together. We also wanted to see if there were differences between the outcomes for men and women, and we wanted to apply it to the specific scenario of the London time trial event. So Steve Lane came to the rescue again, and we were quite close to London at that time. We'd gone past the practice events, the ones that were held in the year prior to the Olympics. And so when we did our study with the competitive male and female cyclists we were able to recruit, we didn't just get them to do a 60-minute time trial as we'd done in Steve's earlier studies, but we actually were able to get the profile of the London time trial course. Again, that was a Dave Martin special, and it probably wasn't done. It wasn't done transparently, but it was all done legally. So we had all the the bits and pieces of that course that were programmed into our ergometers, and so we had our cyclists actually compete over the 29k for the females or the 44k distance for the males. We had them do the mouth rinse in all the trials because we believed that that was going to be beneficial, but one of the things we wanted to work out was how we would do it practically. And we didn't have a lot of time to come up with something that was high tech, but we came up with this idea of using the gel blast that could be in your cheek, which you could just move around from time to time and make different parts of mouth contact. But with our 4 trials, we either had our subjects have the modest dose of caffeine that we now think is probably the optimal dose. We took it in the form of a gum. Again, we were trying some new application of a different kind of a product. And we used the beetroot juice using the high potency nitrate beetroot juice, about 8 millimoles of nitrate taken 2 hours prior to the event. So just jumping to the results, which are in press at the moment in the Applied Nutrition Metabolism Journal. And you can see that compared to the placebo trial or a non-caffeinated trial, adding our 3 milligrams of caffeine gives this, again, very robust result of a 3% improvement in the time trial performance. And I should say there were no differences between males and females, so what I've done is collapse the data in this figure here, and because of the differences in the distance and the differences of the power outputs of the men and women, I've standardised them just to a percentage of their maximal aerobic power. But what we failed to find, and other people have also had the same outcome, is that there was no effect of the beetroot juice when it's given as a single acute dose prior to the time trial on performance. So there was no additive effect or no effect in its own. So the learnings from this study were that the caffeine effect is robust. The gum was a very useful way of being able to take it. We didn't find any differences in the effect of sex on the caffeine benefits, but we couldn't detect any effect of the beetroot juice at that use of just a single acute dose. And we also got feedback from the subjects that they felt that it was practical to be able to use the gel blast and move it round to try and achieve the mouth rinse effect, because obviously in the time trial you don't want to have someone reaching down for the bottle and rinsing with a fluid solution. So the unanswered question in this scenario was, well, what do we do with the nitrate story? What do we tell our athletes going into London? We didn't find an improvement with the beetroot juice. Is that something about beetroot juice per se, the athletes per se, the event per se, or that we hadn't used the right protocol? We're still interested in beetroot juice. We still probably believe there is some benefit to elite athletes, but maybe they have to use it in a different protocol, which might involve a loading phase rather than just the single acute event on the morning. So some benefits from doing the study, but still many unanswered questions.
So moving on to some feedback from riders that will be competing in the Tour as of Saturday. So first of all, the utilisation of caffeine. It's really interesting that they're very aware of the ergogenic properties, but they're very selective of how they use this. So there's some concern over using it habitually in large dosages like you find in sports supplements. And what they try to do is maximise the benefit in and around the key moment in a race, so the closing stages of a race. There's also concern about impact upon sleep, and we heard how important sleep is for recovery. So if you're taking very high doses of caffeine at the end of the stage, that can subsequently impact upon your recovery process. And if it impairs sleep, then that can be detrimental in a stage race. There's also some perception that using caffeine chronically can increase carbohydrate oxidation, which would confer an inefficient outcome in exercise performance. This is just an outline of a training plan from a cyclist, and you can see the periodisation of the general phases and how these teams and riders are now periodising their nutrition. And in this case, it's relatively straightforward with a supplement, but they factor in the period required to load with this particular supplement with beta-alanine, and to ensure that the maintenance phase coincides with the competition phase, so they're getting the benefits from the ergogenic properties of that supplement, and then allow a washout period when there's a period between competition. The carbohydrate mouthwash story is, Louise has already referred to it, but the feedback from the riders on this team was that when they tried using the chew or the gel blast, they found that it impaired ventilation, because having a sweet item in your mouth, and when you were exercising at relatively high intensity, that could arguably have a negative effect on performance. So they've moved to a model where they would prefer to swill their mouth with a carbohydrate drink. So it just gives an example of the individual variability in these particular ergogenic aids in performance. So finally, we just wanted to summarise another aspect of applied nutrition, and one that has gained a lot of interest in the field of strength and power training, but which is quite nicely outlined here in this meta-analysis from Naomi Cermak and Luc van Loon. You can see that in trained and untrained individuals, over time, because I know this area of research is often criticised for only looking at acute changes and muscle synthetic changes, but in this review they quite nicely combine all the studies that look at more chronic effect on muscle strength and muscle hypertrophy, that it appears to be effective. But as I mentioned, this is predominantly in resistance exercise-based models, and there is limited evidence for a comparable effect in endurance exercise. However, there are a few studies that have shown that myofibrilla, so the fraction of protein in the muscle that is important for muscle contraction, synthetic rate is increased following both concurrent, so strength and endurance training, and endurance training alone. So Breen and colleagues here on the left showed that after with carbohydrate and protein, you get an elevation in muscle protein synthesis, but no change in mitochondrial. And then here you can see the elevation with protein in myofibrilla again. So it might be that the timing of protein synthesis for the myofibrilla and mitochondrial fractions differ, and often in many cases this response is only measured up to 4 hours after exercise. It also could be that the mitochondrial protein content, which we know is important for endurance exercise, is proportionally smaller amount of protein in the muscle, so this methodology isn't sensitive enough to pick it up. There has been one study looking at the impact of protein supplementation post-training sessions on endurance performance from Thompson and colleagues in New Zealand, and they did a really tough protocol where they got a group of cyclists to train intensely for 3 days, and afterwards really hit them hard with a protein supplement, 60 grams of whey and 23 grams of leucine, and anyone who knows anything about that quantity, that is pretty high. And in their performance assessment, they didn't just look at a time trial performance, they were interested in a more ecologically valid model where riders actually did repeated sprints, and they found a higher power output over 10 repeated sprints, and the sprints were between 1 to 2 minutes, so an endurance sprint as opposed to a traditional sprint. But that's really the only evidence out there currently that shows a performance impact. That group has gone on to look at the dose response and see, do you really need these mega doses in endurance sport? And they've actually shown, they looked at a dose response model following endurance training or an endurance session, and this is the kind of dosage that they did in the training study. And it appears that if you take the recommendations that come from the resistance strength training, so the lower dose of whey protein or dairy protein, 20 to 25 grams, with a co-ingestion of leucine in the order of 5 grams, because we know that amino acid is important for muscle protein synthesis, you don't get much more benefit by tripling the dose. So it appears from the early research in this field that the recommendations for resistance exercising are potentially relevant to endurance.
So we've got into the protein research area as well, and I don't have anything that's really specific to the cycling scenario for you, but one of the questions that we have tried to address does have some relevance to cycling, in that we were interested to try and look at that protein dose response when an athlete might be in a negative energy deficit or a low energy availability scenario. And that's probably bread and butter for most dietitians, that at some point you're working with an athlete where they're needing to lose body fat and you're wanting them to reduce their energy intake. So we chose to look at the effect of resistance exercise as our exercising model, because we knew that we could be able to pick up the changes in the myofibrillar protein content, just because it's been well developed, and we feel that the sensitivity of the changes, or the sensitivity of the methodology, could meet the recommended changes that we were looking for. So we went in and we had our athletes look at protein synthesis post-resistance exercise in 4 situations. One when they were in their normal energy balance scenario, and then over 3 different trials where they were in a negative energy balance, where we took about 500 calories out of the day, both by reducing intake and increasing some exercise. And so in that very mild energy deficit, we wanted to look at, was there effect of the energy deficit on muscle protein synthesis per se, and in the response to resistance exercise. And we did the 3 different scenarios of having no protein, 15 grams of protein and 30 grams of protein being fed, We also did it with males and females because at this stage there was no data on females to show their dose response. And we wanted to also have a look at the effect of body weight, because so far most of the recommendations for protein are in absolute amounts. We recommend 20-gram dose of protein, and yet that same advice is given to a 50-kilo gymnast to a 120-kilo rower. So we wanted to see if we could, over this, our study with a reasonably large sample size and a whole range of body weights, see if you could find a better correlation between protein synthesis, dose, protein intake and body mass or fat-free body mass. So here's just the bottom line results, and this is in press in the moment in American Journal of Physiology. So here we have the conditions of energy balance, and this is looking at muscle protein synthesis at rest, and you can see even with a very mild energy restriction added to the day, there's a reduction in resting muscle myofibrillary protein synthetic rate. But you can rescue that by doing some resistance exercise, so that might be useful for people who are trying to lose body fat but not wanting to lose any of their muscle mass. That doing some resistance exercise can help you to regain that decrement to the muscle protein synthesis rates. When we looked at the amount of protein synthesis in response to the different protein doses, we found that there was an increasing fractional synthetic rate response to the increasing amount of protein, and it just hadn't topped out at 30 grams. So we didn't find that magic amount, but we found that you need more protein when you're in mild energy restriction to receive the same optimal response to a bout of exercise. And we did find by looking and plotting the body mass outcomes that there was a relationship between the protein synthetic response to a certain amount of protein and body weight, and particularly fat-free mass. And so we now recommend that you would give dosage recommendations for protein intake in terms of the muscle mass or the body mass of the athlete. There isn't a sex difference, but it does confirm the message that we're giving to athletes that if they are in weight loss campaigns or in an energy deficit because of high volume training, that you do need larger amounts of protein both over the day and particularly in each of those feedings that you spread over the day to achieve the maximal response. So we've still got a lot of questions that we need to answer in terms of actually what is that optimal dose. We don't think it's 30, it could even be higher, as I said, because we were still seeing increases even when you look at the fat-free mass relationship, that we didn't find the topping out of the optimal dose in energy restriction. And of course we've only looked at very mild energy restriction, and so for athletes who are even in larger amounts of energy deficit, the situation may be even more extreme.
Thank you. So to conclude on this section on protein, some feedback from riders and staff is the top there. I've tried to outline the current practice post race, which I guess these riders will be going through post each stage for the coming weeks. So typically, despite the lack of evidence for endurance sport, there is an engagement and an appreciation of the value of protein in a recovery beverage following exercise. The amount can exceed 30 grams, so beyond that 20, but arguably may be relevant in light of the research that Louise alluded to on energy deficit. Then obviously there's travel to the hotel, there's a protein intake that coincides with dinner, so this is in this sort of 4-hour window. And then many of you may well be aware now of research emerging on overnight protein, or taking a bolus of protein before sleep, on the understanding that during sleep your body is trying to recover, and if it doesn't impact upon sleep it may be a great way to maximise recovery. And the feedback there is that's very dependent upon the rider's performance goals. So I guess if it's a rider that's interested in winning the overall race, then it might be a strategy that'd be worth exploring. And also whether anyone is undergoing a weight management strategy, so if there is energy deficit and there's a need for increased protein intake, then it might well be worth considering. One feedback we had from the team was that with the improved nutrition understanding in endurance sport, it is no longer the case perhaps that people are losing significant amount of weights. I know in cases like the Grand Tours they are extreme examples, but in the shorter stage races and the one-day races it might be not uncommon that athletes and riders come out gaining weight. And I think that's an important consideration when it comes to applying these recommendations in elite cycling. And this, I guess, a good analogy here that Louise mentioned is in female cyclists, and perhaps in younger cyclists who cover less distance, typically have lower energy demands, have more time to recover in the day, but are utilising the recommendations perhaps targeted at the more severe, prolonged endurance events. like the tour. So to conclude, I guess our key message is to underline the equation that Louise presented at the beginning, that there is a scientific basis behind the recommendations that any applied practitioner is utilising. It should be accompanied with practice in training and a better understanding of what is suitable to that individual and that environment. And important to acknowledge this placebo effect. That given delivered in the right way, it's not a bad thing. It's potentially more powerful and useful in communicating and convincing the coach and the rider of the benefits. And hopefully that will result in success. And the key message really for me is that you don't take the scientific recommendations literally and fill out your bike like this. So thank you very much for your attention. I know some of the speakers are here from the first session, so we're happy to take any questions. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, very good. On carbohydrates specifically, I mean, given the fact that there's 61 studies and 82% significance in terms of improved performance, why is there no health claim for carbohydrate and improved performance?
That's an excellent question. So I can bore you another time with the regulatory standard, but PowerBar is currently submitting a health claim for this. And yes, I guess having been an academic scientist and an applied practitioner now working in industry, there's a lot of red tape, and you would be amazed that we sit here and listen to a lot of feedback upon recommendations based upon scientific research, but that's literally only 20% of the journey as to how you then get to a product and then able to make these claims. One of the frustrations that you have in Europe, which is a very, very strict regulatory environment, is there's no subcategory for sports nutrition. So you have to show a health benefit, and the health benefit is improved performance. Now you're all aware that there's a whole host of mechanistic data out there showing the benefit of carbohydrate, but as you saw from the multiple transportable research, there's only 6 studies. So you've got to convince this regulatory authority that that is a health benefit. So it's a challenge, and maybe it's a marketing challenge rather than a regulatory one, but it's a good point.
A small second question if we can. For an endurance athlete, if they continue to top up with either maltodextrin or glucose, does the body really need fructose?
Can I just add another point to the last question before I answer the second question? And that I think there's a real problem at the moment, that we've got a very big bias against carbohydrate, because, as I said in the previous talk, there's the black and white scenario in the world, that you're either for or against carbohydrate, rather than knowing how and when to use it. And I guess one of the reasons about making health claims is that we might say that it's very good for the performance aspects of sports nutrition, but there's times when, as James has shown us, you don't want to be having the carbohydrate in the adaptive side of sports nutrition. So to come up with the perfect statement that gets that right, and that could go across the elite athlete to the person who's exercising in the gym to lose weight, I think it'd be really difficult to find the scenario that you can do that in that simplistic form. But because we've got so much of this vested interest trying to tell us that carbohydrate is evil, we've got problems. And I mean, I was here for the London Olympics, and I remember that Panorama documentary that came out just on the eve, and the British Medical Journal articles, and I just feel aggrieved that the title of that British Medical Journal article was 40 years of sports nutrition and nothing to show for it. I mean, that's tabloid, isn't it? It's just a really interesting world that we live in at the moment, where good evidence can be just completely rubbed out and completely explained by this industry bias, and that all of us in this room are somehow captured by some evil industry that's made us think in a way that's not truthful. So that's why I would answer that question. Sorry, I've lost the thread of the question. And so that's I guess the next part of it, that the reason that it's useful in the scenario of the prolonged exercise is if there's a limit to the amount of intestinal absorption of one particular type of carbohydrate, then finding another carbohydrate with an alternative absorption mechanism is a smart way of being able to get more across. And I think this is a very specific scenario for where the fructose role in sports nutrition has a place. But that's a very specific scenario, and I think in the bigger, broader message of community nutrition, where again there's so much negativity about fructose, and rightly so when you think of the amount of the high fructose corn syrups and the consumption of fructose completely out of context and in much larger doses than any of us would ever recommend, then it's really difficult to again get that message across when the world is all about 140 characters these days, so it's almost impossible to have the complexity of what we know being able to be summarised so insanely.
Any other questions? Ben?
Louise, you've talked about using placebos and the placebo effect with athletes in a sort of practical setting. In your experience, do you find that continues to work, or do they sort of start to get wise to it sometimes?
When I talk about the placebo effect, I think I'm talking about the active confidence around using evidence-based products. I'm not talking about using just nonsense and saying, oh, that's better than nothing, or I'm tricking my athlete into to doing better because they believe in Smarties or whatever I've given them. I believe that it has to be an evidence-based element to start with, and then you add to that the whole experience. And part of the placebo effect is the athlete knowing that they've got you in their corner, that you've spent a lot of time together coming up with something that works for them, that they feel special, that they've got an individualised approach. I mean, that's what I'm calling the placebo effect. But there was a really interesting symposium at ACSM that I attended this year about the placebo effect, and one of the things that's driven me mad about the supplement practices of a lot of athletes is that even if what they're using is all nonsense, and they'll tell you that it's all about just getting the placebo effect, I don't think they get it well, because it's so chaotic and frenetic the way they use supplements. They're using a bit of this and a bit of that and something else added, and they've forgotten this one, and so I don't think that they're maximising that whole way in which you could build up a level of confidence about it. And at the symposium at ACSM, a neurologist spoke to us about how the placebo effect only works if you've had a preconditioned response to an expected outcome. So you only get the placebo effect truly by having some scenario in which you have developed the outcome that you want, so that the improved performance or whatever, and you've patterned those pathways into your brain in association with something, and then independently that same repetitive activity will achieve the improvement in performance. And so there's a lot that we need to now know about how we build up the best placebo effect, but it is a very real effect, but it can be applied better than we've been currently using it. So I'm certainly thinking about going back to some of my friends who've got connections in this area to see if we can start doing some research on how to get the best out of that placebo effect. But it certainly isn't just a matter of saying I feel special, I'm having something that someone else hasn't got, therefore I'm going to perform better.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, Louise, you were mentioning caffeine gum. How did it taste? Because we had some experience with caffeine gum for Beijing, and the first couple of trials were awful.
It gets very bitter, and so I guess what we learnt to do was to help the athlete to chew it for the certain number of minutes before it becomes bitter, and we also did it serially, so that we didn't take it all at the one time. We took like a little bit, then a little bit, and then a little bit in a close period of time, so that we never got to the point where you had a whole mouthful of very bitter tasting product. But we did find that people have completely different reactions to that bitter taste. And I was telling Ron Maughan about this, and he said, oh, you can explain that just by asking people if they take sugar in their coffee, because those people who like a bitter taste don't have sugar in their coffee, and they're quite happy to have the caffeine taste predominating, whereas people that hate that bitter taste and have to mask it will be more sensitive to it when they have it just in the gum.
Okay, thanks for your attention and thanks for your questions. I don't want to eat into your lunchtime anymore, pun intended. So thanks, and enjoy the rest of the conference.